Thor, the god of thunder, born a symbol of traditional masculinity, strong, violent, emotionless, expert at wielding a hammer. Curt Thompson states in his book, The Soul of Shame, retelling the stories we believe about ourselves. It may be revealing to know that telling your story begins with someone else. Long before you arrive on the scene, before and then after you were conceived, people started talking about you. They talked about your gender, what you will be named, who they hope you will resemble in appearance and character. And even before this, perhaps your parents had months or even years of longing for you. Or perhaps no one longed for you, and you were eventually passed on to someone else for your care. We are all born out of preludes of beauty and tragedy, each of us with our own ratio of both. You began your life out of and into this narrative that others were already telling. So was born Thor, son of Odin, destined to rule Asgard. Born a god, into leadership and all that comes with it. Violence, strength, unwavering character, and stoic in emotion. The god of thunder and wielder of Mjolnir, a channel for lightning. Born to be swift and loud in both action and words. Expected to become worthy of wielding a hammer, a man's weapon. Rugged, tough, relentless, unable to feel pain. Unallowed to connect with his emotions, but constantly expected to deal pain without feeling any, no matter how much he was hurting.
Oh, Hellwalkers, you just blast them apart. Poof. Problem solved. Don't have to think, feel.
Expected to always drop the hammer on his enemies, but never let the hammer drop from his hands, a quality which the father possessed in abundance. In Norse mythology, these are gods who are doomed and know it, and like many men, they are determined to get all the pleasure they can from life before they die. Courage, strength, and cleverness are what count to them. And so, Thor rose to the occasion as the god he is. He met these expectations as best he could. He became worthy of wielding his hammer, constantly afraid of dropping it out of unworthiness. One is free from depression, writes Alice Miller in The Drama of the Gifted Child, when self-esteem is based on the authenticity of one's own feelings, and not on the possession of certain qualities. This is not the case for Thor, whose entire self-worth, or lack thereof, is derived from validation of meeting the expectations placed on him from and even before birth.
If you can't be yourself, you also might not feel like you can follow your own path.
Seems stupid to gripe about the things we can't change.
Who says we can't?
Among these expectations, show no emotions unless they are of strength, anger, or power. Vulnerability is a weakness, and courage shown through violence and indulgence.
For men, shame is not a bunch of competing, conflicting expectations. Shame is one. Do not be perceived as what? Weak. You say to reach out, tell our story, be vulnerable.
I'd say the moment calls for calm. Yeah.
As researcher Brad Shaw writes, a child who has been denied the experience of connecting with his own emotions, as is the case for Thor, who is constantly reminded by Odin that his emotions are a failure, is first consciously and then unconsciously dependent on his parents. Alice Miller continues, he cannot rely on his own emotions, has not come to experience them through trial and error, has no sense of his own real needs, and is alienated from himself to the highest degree. Such a person cannot separate from his parents. He is fantasy bonded to them. He has an illusion of connection. He really thinks there is a love relationship between himself and his parents. Actually, he is fused and enmeshed.
Dying is what we Aesir live for. And let's be honest, they were kinda useless. But Baldur, he had value.
This is an entrapment rather than a relationship. Throughout God of War Ragnarok, Thor's relationship to his father is built on one thing: shame. Odin repeatedly ignores, belittles, or embarrasses Thor. Despite this, Thor remains loyal to his father and unable to think or feel for himself. Thor does not believe he can truly be himself, as his identity is too entangled with the expectations his father has placed on him. He becomes trapped, and he is thus unable to change. Later on, this fantasy bond will be transferred to other relationships. This fantasy bonded person is still dependent on affirmation from his partner, his children, his job. He is especially dependent on his children. A fantasy-bonded person never has a real connection or a real relationship with anyone. There is no real, authentic self there for another to relate to. The real parents, who only accepted the child when he pleased them, remain as introjected voices. The true self hides from these introjected voices, just as the real child did. The loneliness of the parental home is replaced by isolation within the self.
You think you can come here, become a daddy, get a clean slate? That ain't how it works. You're a destroyer, like me.
With his wife and with his daughter and her brothers before her, Thor is unable to form a meaningful bond. He remains too reliant on the toxic relationship his father has ensnared him in that is now being passed on to his own children.
I could give a hot shit about your fatherly advice.
Researchers show that emotional abandonment is most often multi-generational. That child then becomes an adult child, and the cycle is repeated.
Modi sought us in fear of you. He died of the wounds you gave him. Oh, we got a model father.
Being abandoned through the neglect of our developmental dependency needs is the major factor in becoming an adult child. We grow up, we look like adults, we walk and talk like adults, but beneath the surface is a little child who feels empty and needy, a child whose needs are insatiable because he has a child's needs in an adult body.
Noob Master, hey, it's Thor again. You know, the god of thunder? Listen, buddy, if you don't log off this game immediately, I'm gonna fly over to your house, come down to that basement you're hiding in, rip off your arms, and shove
This
them up
insatiable
your butt.
child is the core of all compulsive or addictive behavior. And thus, Thor retreats within himself, unwilling to show his true nature to the world, too busy acting as the man his father told him he was destined to be, and repeatedly reminds him he will never be good enough to become.
When he asked about men, what do men in this country need to do to conform with male norms? The answers were always show emotional control, work is first, pursue status, and violence.
Grandiosity is often the result of all this. The grandiose person is admired everywhere and cannot live without admiration. If his talents fail him, it is catastrophic. He must be perfect, otherwise depression is near. Often the most gifted among us are driven in precisely this manner. Many of the most gifted people suffer from severe depression. It cannot be otherwise because depression is about the lost and the abandoned child within. Odin has long since abandoned Thor as a worthy son. Nonetheless, Thor's adventures grow theatrically bigger, more grandiose, increasingly epic.
About time.
In constant search of validation, unable to become his true self, Thor is a hollow character in his own movie. He remains a child in an adult's body. He plays the part written for him, thinking he is not good enough to write his own part. The fight or flight response is triggered by the shame he feels and leads him to freeze, become stagnant. This response allows his all-knowing father to move him around the board, a pawn in his father's game of life, rather than a king in his own game.
And your boy, Allfather, has plans for him. There he is. There's the god of war.
Alice Miller writes further, more often than not, these narcissistically deprived are talented, gifted, highly successful superachievers who have been praised and admired for their talents and achievements. Anyone looking at them from the outside would believe these people have made it. They appear strong and stable and full of self-assurance. This is not the case. Narcissistically deprived people do well in every undertaking and are admired for their gifts and talents, but they have a deep sense of emptiness and aloneness. Once the drug of grandiosity is taken away, as soon as they are no longer the stars and superachievers, they are plagued by deep feelings of shame and guilt.
I know you're disappointed.
Disappointed? No. That was a glorious fight. You can't even say you're sorry this time, can you? Because what's one more broken promise? Grandfather treated you like crap. You were struggling. I get it. But you can't just...
In the time between his increasingly grand adventures, Thor is a lost soul. His self-worth is soaked in shame, a feeling he is not good enough, unworthy of his hammer, a disgrace to his name, and a failure. Despite all he has accomplished, his power and might, he feels he is not good enough. Thor believes that to his father, Odin, then to his wife, to his daughter, and most of all to his sons, he failed to meet their expectations and their needs because he failed to become the god he was born to be. Of this, Thor feels intense shame, though he is not allowed to show or talk about it, and therefore attempts to bury it with devastating results. He experiences and therefore feels shame. The technical definition of shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. We all experience shame. It is universal. It is a primitive emotion shared by everyone unless they completely lack empathy or the capacity for human connection. It's not easy to talk about shame. Even mentioning the word shame can lead to an experience of the emotion and evoke a strong sense of fear. Most often, shame is associated with a past or a present that we had little or no control over. For example, shame is infertility. Shame is flunking out of school twice. Shame is hiding the fact that I'm in recovery. Shame is bankruptcy. Our healthy shame is essential as the foundation of our spirituality. By reminding us of our essential limitations, our healthy shame lets us know that we are not God. Our healthy shame points us in the direction of some larger meaning. Our healthy shame is the psychological ground for our humility. The trouble is, Thor is supposed to be a god.
Ain't that impressive? Real god stuff.
You are a god.
You're damn right.
Instead of being comforted by not being God, Thor just feels deeper shame as he was born to be a god. So, his shame is toxic rather than helpful and leads to responses with negative consequences.
Sticking your hand in lava is never gonna feel good.
Mood alteration is an ingredient of compulsive, addictive behavior. Addiction has been described as a pathological relationship to any mood-altering experience that has life-damaging consequences. Toxic shame has been suggested as the core and fuel of all addiction. This toxic shame, learned at an early age and pounded into his thinking by Odin,
You're no fun anymore. Thor! Get down here!
All father.
Don't do that! And this stealthy side of beef. You both behave out there?
Thor was really great. I learned a lot from him.
You learned something from him? Really now? Okay. What did you teach the kid?
Nothing. What could I possibly teach him?
Exactly. Okay, you did it. We are on the verge of great things. All of our work together.
You're welcome.
And your husband started drinking again, all on his own. Dismissed!
He's not protecting us.
he responds with violent outbursts, lashing out at those he loves, and addiction. According to Bradshaw, a person with internalized shame believes he is inherently flawed, inferior, and defective. Such a feeling is so painful that defending strategies are developed to cover it up. These strategies are the roots of violence, criminality, war, and all forms of addiction. Our society is highly addictive. We have 60 million sexual abuse victims. Possibly 75 million lives are seriously affected by alcoholism, with no telling how many more through other drugs. We have no idea of the actual impact on our economy of the billions of tax-free dollars that come from the illegal drug trade. Over 15 million families are violent. Some 60% of women and 50% of men have eating disorders. We have no actual data on work addiction or sexual addictions. I saw a recent quotation that cited 13 million gambling addicts. If toxic shame is the fuel of addiction, we have a massive problem of shame in our society. Condemning others as bad or sinful is a way to feel self-righteous. Such a feeling is a powerful mood alteration and can become highly addictive. Curt Thompson adds, from his book The Soul of Shame, retelling the stories we believe about ourselves. With little to no awareness, we seamlessly respond to shame with judgment, which emerges as words, but more significantly, these words carry the emotional arrows slung as much at ourselves as they are at others. So even those judging Thor for his addiction to alcohol, violence, and anger may in fact be falling prey to addictive behavior of a different sort. It is difficult to be sure our own house is in order before judging the houses of others, because judgment makes us feel better about our own situations. Per Bradshaw, the most paradoxical aspect of neurotic shame is that it is the core motivator of the superachieved and the underachieved, the star and the scapegoat, the righteous and the wretched, the powerful and the pathetic. Thor's judgment comes as much from the internal dialogue as from external voices. Even us, the audience, judged Thor when we were first shown the character in the game. We judged the design of the character for his weight and his unkempt, rugged appearance. We have expectations of a super fit and handsome, clean-cut Thor because of the Marvel movies, and this Thor does not live up to those expectations we placed on him. Thor judges himself for failing to protect his sons, live up to his father's expectations, failures as a husband, and continued failure as a father to his daughter, all of whom he loves very much. Unfortunately, he feels unworthy of their love. Most of all, he feels unworthy of even self-love.
I'm doing the best I can to keep this family together.
If that were true, you'd stand up to your father for once in your life.
You're right.
Honey.
No. You're right. What kind of example am I setting? Seems the only thing I can do right these days is destroy everything around me.
We need you here.
Shame can cause someone to achieve either great or terrible things. Shame does not care whether the response it garners results in great accomplishment or in stagnancy. For Thor, the shame he feels results in both extremes. He accomplishes incredible feats on the battlefield and incredible stagnancy in his personal life, relationships, and self-growth. According to the Neuroscience of Shame, written by the CPTSFoundation.org, a child exposed to toxic shame has a conundrum. Their brain experiences the arousal of the sympathetic nervous system and the acceleration of the parasympathetic nervous system at the same time. The result is that as an automobile, they sit and spin their tires, unable to move forward in their understanding of other relationships they encounter later in life. This is because a toxic shame experience in childhood impacts the hippocampus, responsible for consolidating memory. Bradshaw builds on this by saying, toxically shamed people tend to become more and more stagnant as life goes on. They live in a guarded, secretive, and defensive way. They try to be more than human, perfect and controlling, or less than human, losing interest in life or stagnated in some addictive behavior. The pain and suffering of shame generate automatic and unconscious defenses. Freud called these defenses by various names: denial, idealization of parents, repression of emotions, and dissociation from emotions. What is important to note is that we can't know what we don't know. Denial, idealization, repression, and dissociation are unconscious survival mechanisms. Because they are unconscious, we lose touch with the shame, hurt, and pain they cover up. We cannot heal what we cannot feel. So, without recovery, our toxic shame gets carried for generations. Thor believes he is not allowed to show emotion because he is still trying to be the character he thinks the world expects him to be. He is unaware that this is a learned behavior from his childhood and life experience. However, as stated earlier, another teaching from childhood is that his character demands courage, strength, and power above all else. Thor does not realize vulnerability is courageous. It is powerful, and his vulnerabilities are not weakness.
Don't you know what I've done? Yes! But what will you do now? We don't change.
His vulnerabilities are there to protect him in a dangerous world. They aren't to be ignored or believed to be unworthy of recognition. This is why we wear clothes, live in houses, and have speed limits. So much of what we do in life is designed, among other things, to protect us from the fact that we are vulnerable at all times. To be human is to be vulnerable. Healing shame requires our being vulnerable with other people in embodied actions. There is no other way. But shame will, as we will see, attempt to convince us otherwise. Identifying and addressing vulnerability gives us power. Most importantly, power over ourselves. But that's a problem. Shame derives its power from being unspeakable. Ignored and avoided, it becomes a silent epidemic, spreading fear and encouraging negative behavior and thinking. Our culture does not handle emotions well. We like folks to be happy and fine. We learn rituals of acting happy and fine at an early age. I can remember many times telling people I'm fine when I felt like the world was caving in on me. We don't want a president who has emotions. We would rather have one that can act. Emotions are certainly not acceptable in the workplace. True expression of any emotions that are not positive are met with disdain. To get to Thursday, named Thursday in honor of Thor, one must make it over Hump Day, Wednesday, named after Odin. Thor must have the courage and the vulnerability to validate and face his toxic relationship with his father and the expectations placed on him with shame. Empathy creates a hostile environment for shame. It can't survive. They went on to say that sharing their experience of shame with others who expressed empathy, they were able to move forward. Empathy is central. We need to hear and feel someone saying, I get it. I've felt the same way. What you are feeling is normal. It's okay. I understand what you are going through.
I don't even know what you're trying to do anymore, but you have no idea the kind of shit I've been through.
Right. Half giant, son of a powerful god with impossibly high expectations. How could I ever know what that's like?
Connection is a vital aspect of shame resilience, enabling us to feel valued, affirmed, and accepted. When we feel worthless, rejected, and unworthy of belonging, we feel shame. When we feel shame, we must learn to ask for what we need. Failing to speak, keeping it secret, and experiencing judgment are fanning the flame. After all, when we can't find the right words or don't have the right opportunity and audience, we are left alone with our fears. We shut down and accept our lot. Shame thrives when we feel most alone, cut off, separate, and different from those closest to us. Shame happens in the gaps between people. When separation is removed or lessened, the feeling loses its power over us. Brown suggests using Neff's 3 elements to improve self-compassion and therefore self-empathy. 1. Practice self-kindness over self-judgment. 2. Practice common humanity over isolation. 3. Practice mindfulness rather than over-identification. Bradshaw reminds us, giving and receiving unconditional love is the most effective and powerful way to personal wholeness and happiness. Thor receives unconditional love most evidently from his daughter.
We're here for you. Mom and I are here for you. Even when you're here. We love you. You know that.
He also receives it from his wife, and amazingly from his enemy in Kratos.
Can I come in?
What remains is the inability to love himself unconditionally. He believes he is unable to change, and he hates himself for it. Kratos shows Thor he is worthy of change. He can change, and even has the obligation to change, to show his unconditional love to his children and future generations. Thor is worthy of loving himself unconditionally and ending the cycle of toxic shame taught to him by his father and perpetuated by him up to the game's dramatic conclusion. Kratos passes on to Thor the wisdom learned from his late wife.
We are not our failures. We are not who we were. We must be better.
Goodness and beauty can prevail in the face of overwhelming shame. In a few seconds of time, despite all his failures, Thor is redeemed. Rather than allowing himself to be the villain in the story of his life, Thor takes control of his destiny. He becomes who he was always meant to be. He is not who he was, who the world told him to be. He changes into the man he is, a better man. It reminds us all, it is never too late to change, to become the hero of our own story. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, or at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly.
This isn't you.
No.
This